On day two of the trial was Thursday, May 18th. Dr. James Stars was the first witness you called as a counterpoint to the scientific witnesses that petitioners brought forth the day before. Dr. Stars had testified in judicial proceedings before, and you write in your book that you actually had no idea exactly what he was going to testify to because compared to everyone else, he had chosen not to do any prep work with you. So, were you nervous about having to call Dr. Stars first, and what was kind of the main takeaway of his testimony?
Well, his testimony was very, very important as it turned out. Yes, with people like Terry and Steve and Mike, that we followed the classic routine. I asked them, I learned from them, and then I eventually was able to say, okay, here's what I'll ask each of you to set the stage and elicit your testimony. I tried to do that with Stars, but he said, no, I'm not going to spend any time preparing. I said, well, it would really help. He says, no, I don't need to prepare. And I said, just how about, he said, no, don't worry. He said, don't worry about it. So I said, okay. I mean, he wasn't going to be prepared. And as it turned out, I didn't have to worry. He was a very experienced witness. His testimony was excellent. He kind of took the uncertainties that the first three scientific witnesses for the petitioners and ran with it and exposed it and made the case that this is just not a case that's ready for exhumation. And I'll just say he probably was instrumental in laying a key marker in the trial, maybe a turning point. When I asked him, that Stars on the left, when I asked him, um, what's the effect of not being sure exactly where John Wilkes Booth is buried in the family plot? And he, the professional witness and very, very good and articulate speaker, he was looking at me. When he got the question, he then turned and looked right at Judge Kaplan and said, Judge Kaplan, if you order this exhumation, you will really be ordering an archaeological dig. And again, I saw Kaplan's face twitch. And quite frankly, the first day, Judge Kaplan was much too accommodating to the petitioners. So I was quite happy to see Judge Kaplan react that way to what Starr said. He was also very entertaining because of the people he had exhumed. So he was a
Yeah,
great witness.
your book it gives his background. It's very interesting. The exhumations he had taken part in. So after Dr. Stars, there was a history witness for the petitioners, and that is historian Gene Baker, shown here kind of in the middle. Dr. Baker had written about Mary Todd Lincoln, but was not a historian on the Lincoln assassination. And her testimony doesn't seem to have helped the petitioners much. She thought maybe to try do the exhumation more as a curiosity more, but she wasn't a true believer even herself. And then the next witness after that was our own Steve Miller. Now, originally, there was going to be a different order, as Steve alluded to. Frank was going to open with Mike to talk about the assassination and the identification of Booth throughout his escape. Then Steve was going to talk about Booth's identification at the Garrett farm and back in Washington. And then Terry was going to come in at the end and do the post-mortem movements of Booth from 1865 into his burial at Greenmount in 1869. But due to Steve being an out-of-towner with a busy schedule and being a bit of a prima donna, I mean, let's be honest, you you took him first. So, Steve, I'm gonna bother you right now. So, Steve, set the scene for us. Had you attended the trial on the first day? And what was your experience like witnessing the trial and then being called up to testify?
No, I wasn't there the first day. Unfortunately, the big mystery project that we had and things like that precluded me from doing anything other than flying in one night, testifying, and then leaving the next morning. And I regretted the fact that I couldn't hear the testimony from the other people and things like that. But as I said, what I tried to do was I tried to limit the study that I had done to the question of whether Booth was killed there or not, and who was at Garrett's farm. And luckily, I had the papers, and I was able to bring them with me. And the other story that I mentioned a while ago was I had already, after the Unsolved Mysteries, I had already written an article about Wilson Kinsey, and blew a big hole in his recollections and things like that. I had met his granddaughter, who had known him when she was a child, and she shared the papers and things with me, and that was good. That's a photo of her on the right up there with her grandfather, charming woman, and believed the stories and things that he told, even though they were contradictory. And then she passed away, and her son continued that, and he put out a pamphlet and everything that I was able to bring in of the recollections that he had, and that I found contradictory evidence. For instance, the photo there that was taken in early 1865. The one of him in uniform on the left, and he doesn't have any sergeant chevrons on his sleeve, and that was one of the key elements in there, that he had met Booth when Booth was in New Orleans, and that he was the sergeant that got to show them all around, and they became good buddies. And he and Joe Zizgen of the Garrett's Farm Patrol, later the Garrett's Farm Patrol, rode together like brothers, and things like that. And I was able to get a lot of information in terms of that, and say, no, I don't believe that. The other article that I wrote that I testified about, the other person I testified about is further down, and that was William Allen, who supposedly was a lieutenant at the time. He played one of the key roles in the Unsolved Mysteries episode. He was one of the two that I mentioned earlier that had popped in from off camera and said, "No, that's not Booth. I knew him, and he's got red hair." And all of that. I hadn't gotten very much information about him. I had seen the one article where his widow, that's she in the middle there, and she had said in an 1937 interview that her husband had known Booth, and all of that. And I was curious to find out more about it. Before the trial, I had actually called Nate Orlowick and had a chat with him, and we discussed some of the things. And then he said, "Oh, that he had been in touch with the Allen family." And I said, "Oh, did you get any information from them?" And he said, "No, I never followed up with them." And I thought that was a little odd. And I said, "Well, do you mind if I contacted them?" And he said, "No." And I contacted the members of the Allen family that were living back in Long Island. And one was the grandsons. There were a couple of grandsons who believed this story, and then their mother, who had also known Allen when she was a young girl. And I pieced together the information that they had to say about how Allen was here and he was there. And like the members of the Kinsey family, they believed the story for till their dying day, that he had done this. The problem with the Allen story is that there was so much to it. They believed, for instance, that Allen had been a soldier that had been at the Battle of Monocacy, which he was, and that he had been captured, which he was, and that he had been a prisoner of war for a short period of time, and that also that he was a lieutenant at that time, and that he was a member of the Secret Service at that time, and that he was bodyguard to General Grant, and then later he was a Secret Service agent that had been sent to Europe, and he had pranked Edwin Booth by coming up, and since he looked so much like John Wilkes Booth himself, that he appeared in the window of Edwin's carriage, and Edwin said, "John, John," and then he disappeared. And I looked into the thing. It's like, first of all, this is way too much for him to have done. And I looked into his service record that Mr. Hall helped me get, and it showed me that he was nowhere near that. In fact, he was probably on the way back to New York, where he was originally from, to visit his father, who was on his deathbed. And the more I got into it, the more it's like, gee whiz. The family later even went to the point of claiming that Lieutenant Allen, who was a lieutenant by the end of the war, but wasn't a lieutenant at the time of Garrett's Farm, that he had been up for the Medal of Honor, hoping at the Battle of Monocacy, but they couldn't give him one because they didn't have enough metal to put in the medal to give him the thing. And it's like, oh. So I published the two articles about these two guys, and that was one of the things that I was able to testify about. It's, well, your two witnesses who say that they were there and that the guy had red hair really has no credibility.
Yeah. So do you recall being cross-examined by Mark Zaid? So we haven't talked much about Mr. Zaid. I'm going to show a picture of him right now, who was the lawyer for the petitioners. Um, and obviously he was a major player in this whole thing. So do you recall being cross-examined, and what
I,
are
I do. I do. Um, he tried his best to go through and postulate different things, the what ifs, and maybe this is that, and how did they know? And one of the contentions that the petitioners said in here was that you can't trust any of the witnesses, the soldiers and so on, that were at Garrett's Farm, because they had a vested interest in proving that it was Booth, because they wouldn't have got any reward. And there was this idea that they would go along with this because of the thing. And my counter to the whole thing was, well, maybe they just got a reward for a job well done. And he went through all of the different things. He tried several things to do it. I thought he did a good job. But one thing, when I was looking back through the trial thing, I amused myself, as I sometimes do. There was a one of the last questions that they had, I think it was in cross, and he was asking me about the question. Said, if the body's not exhumed, do you believe that the theory that John Wilkes Booth might have escaped will go away? And I said, I don't believe that the theory of John Wilkes Booth escaped will go away either way. I don't think that. I think there will be people who continue debating this long after all of us are in our grave. And I think the controversy will just go on. And at one point, he said, he was asking me about why I was doing this. And I said, well, I'm trying to get the evidence of the people who really were there and to get it on the record, because I thought that was important. And he said, um, well, if there's no controversy, then why do you continue to thrash it out? And I said, why do I continue to thrash it out? Oh my, thrashing it out. And then he said, well, the evidence stands by itself. And I said, no, I don't think um, that I'm trying to get the evidence out on the public record so that we do this. And I said, that's what I'm doing. I don't know if that's thrashing it out. Gee, I hope not. That sounds painful. And he said, well, in a cordial manner, of course. And I said, yes, of course. But I think that he did a pretty good job. I was thinking about it later. I found an article that was written by Richard Bainham Garrett in 1907. Someone had asked him about Finus Bates' book, if he had read it. And at first he said, no, I haven't read it. And then later, he did read it, and he wrote a scathing review of the whole thing that was published in the Memphis paper, which I thought was kind of like in your eye, because that's where Finus Bates was from. And on one thing, he goes through and he talks about the Bates' description of what the house was like, and he says, no, that wasn't it at all. And then Bates made the comment that when the soldiers had first come by, that Booth and Harold had gone into the woods behind the house, and then later they came back. And Bates said, well, how did they know it was the same people that came back? And uh, uh, Richard Bainham Garrett said, did they think it was so foolish that we wouldn't recognize the rest of the people? And one thing that made me laugh was when he goes through and he talks about Bates had said that there really wasn't a barn that would have burned, and things like that. And in his review, Richard Bainham Garrett said, on page 163, Mr. Bates argues like a lawyer with a bad case. And I thought that was funny. But uh, you know, I try to let the evidence speak for itself. One of the things that I learned from Mr. Kaufman a long time ago is that you really need to go back and get the earliest documents and records and things that you have that you can, and to look at that, because it's probably the most accurate, and that everything else is contradictory, the vicissitudes of memory, and that sort of thing. And that's what I've been trying to do. But like I said, I'm not interested in the other thing. But I was happy to come and do all of the things. And I thought Mr. Zaid did a pretty good job of trying to poke holes and things in there. And as I said, I laughed when I read what Richard Bainham Garrett said when he said that he argues like a lawyer with a bad case.
Yeah, and I imagine you were probably feeling pretty good after your testimony, because I think Zaid was also a lawyer with a bad case, not any fault of his own, but the things itself.
Yeah, well,
Um,
I think he did a pretty good job. But it's like,
yeah.
what's the old thing? If you don't have the evidence, you argue the law, and if you don't have the law, you argue the evidence, and if you don't have either one, you give them the old razzle dazzle. So
Maybe. All right. Thank you, Steve. So, so that was our day two. And so that was just those three witnesses. Because as we can tell, Steve is very long-winded, so it took a while. I'm just kidding, Steve. So day three of the trial is Friday, May 19th, and on this day, Zaid brought a witness who testified about the exhumation of Lee Harvey Oswald, which was an interesting but pretty irrelevant case to the matter at hand. And then after that, Professor William Hanchett, author of the Lincoln Murder Conspiracies, testified as an expert witness on the part of the defense. And Frank, you refer to the late Dr. Hanchett as the professorial gray hair who filled the role of the distinguished Lincoln scholar historian. And Dr. Hanchett was from California, and he actually stayed with you during his time in Maryland. Frank, what was your purpose in having Dr. Hanchett as a witness, and what was the effect of his testimony?
Well, when we had our meetings, I looked around at everybody, and everybody looked young.
And they
And
still do.
yeah, they still do. And Mr. Hall was probably the oldest among us. And so I think I said this openly. Um, this is a great team, but I'd like to have a little gray hair gravitas. Someone with not only a book in their mind or in process, but someone who's already been recognized. And so again, James O. Hall to the rescue. He wrote a letter to Hanchett. We have it. And he says, he quotes, he says, Mr. Gorman wants someone with gray hair. Um, and Hanchett thought about it for a couple of days, and then he came. And he, again, was excellent, to the point, very impressive. And I'll say one thing about the title of my book, which is Confronting Bad History. It was Dr. Hanchett who first used that phrase.
Oh.
He said, he called the Bates book Bad History. And he said, the problem with bad history is that it crowds out the real history. It crowds out the good history. So that's where that title comes from, because Bill Trimble is the one who decided that we would confront this bad history with the people that are on the screen here today. So Hanchett was a wonderful witness.
And then after Dr. Hanchett, Nate Orlowick took the stand on behalf of the petitioners. And we'll come back to Nate in a little bit. And so, as I'd love to get everyone's opinion about his testimony, but Nate was the last of the petitioners' witnesses. But the defense had really just barely started. We had Dr. Stars and then Steve, and that was it. And so after Nate, that is when Bill, you were called to the stand. And so I have another picture from all the hubbub going on outside of the courtroom every day. And so here's a picture of you, Bill, from the trial. And Bill, you were called on the stand to testify on behalf of Greenmount Cemetery. And I know we've lost your video, but that's okay. I'll have this picture of you. And so, Bill, you acted not only as a client, but essentially as a co-counsel to Frank during the trial. And as the only member of the panel with a background in law, what was your perspective on the trial as it was ongoing?
Well, I was very confident that we, I think we started off with a win, and I think we just kept building on it. And there was a point in the proceeding to which Frank has referred when Judge Kaplan really leaned forward and really appeared convinced by the testimony of, I think, Mr. Stars.
I'm gonna ask you a similar question that I asked Frank, that Frank asked you, sorry, when you were on the stand. Do we know exactly where John Wilkes Booth is buried in Greenmount Cemetery?
We do not. And the reason for that was quite evident. Um, John Wilkes Booth had assassinated a president of the United States who was much loved in much of the country. And people do very violent things with bodies of people who assassinate over history. You read stories about that. And I wanted to make my strategy, or I should say the cemetery strategy, is let's us put a legal end to all this talk and to establish the true facts of of Booth's death and his burial at Greenmount Cemetery. And that it became res judicata. The case can never be tried anywhere else. It's already final law.
So why is it that we don't know? We know Booth is buried in the Booth family plot. Why is it that we don't know? Because most of the time, most cemeteries and plots, you have plot maps where they show where people are buried. Does that exist for the Booth lot to see where
Wait,
John Wilkes Booth is?
did you just say he's in the Booth lot? We don't know.
Oh, okay. Then tell me more about that. Why is it possible that he may not even be in the Booth lot?
Because for the very simple reason that if someone knew where he was buried, people of a malicious intent could come in and try to dig up the body. So what evidently happened, and this is conjecture, that the board of trustees had decided that the burial was to be secret somewhere in the 65 acres, or in those days, the 80 acres of land. And the superintendent was sworn to secrecy. In all likelihood, say 2 laborers were hired from the city of somewhere in the city of Baltimore and having no connection whatsoever with Greenmount Cemetery. They were simply told to dig a grave. And that is where Booth was buried. We know that Booth was buried. There are records in the Episcopal Church archives that shows the name of the rector, where he conducted a service, and who was buried. And there is a record in Greenmount's record showing that John Wilkes Booth was buried at Greenmount Cemetery in the same day, but everyone else was sworn to secrecy. And when I talked to our superintendent, who had been at the cemetery for many years, he didn't know. He had not been told anything by his predecessor, and so the secret is there. And we know that Booth is buried at Greenmount, but we quite honestly do not know where he is buried. And I was prepared under oath to swear to that.
And
Because
that became a part too, where you had, the assumption is that he's buried in the Booth lot, that the family buried him there. But
no,
as the trial went on, there were some outside sources who contacted both Judge Kaplan and told stories about, oh, I heard that Booth, Granddaddy told me that Booth was actually buried in this part of the cemetery and stuff like that, and that you had to address those stories in the court.
well, there are all sorts of stories, as you know. Uh, Americans love legend. Truth sometimes just or doesn't necessarily takes a secondary place. Uh, you were referring to Judge Kaplan called counsel up uh, uh, and said, "I want you to know that while we took a recess, a lady called up and said that she was the great great granddaughter, I think, or great great yes, of the funeral director who in whose establishment Booth's coffin had been brought." And said the woman to Judge Kaplan, "My great great aunt or great great grandmother, whoever she was, drove me around the cemetery and said, you know, John Wilkes Booth is not buried there." And we drove a little farther and said, "He's buried there." Well, so Judge Kaplan said, "I'm appointing Mr. Trimble as the representative of this court to go and interview this lady and see what can be done." I went and talked to her, and she said, I think she said 7 years old. I didn't know who John Wilkes Booth was. She said, "I couldn't possibly tell you where in the cemetery it was, either of the sites." And so that was an interesting sidelight, but there was, and in a way, it was, she also, at the time I interviewed her, was apparently under a sort of a physical problem and could not come and testify in court.
Gotcha. So yeah, but that idea that the cemetery, honestly, from a lack of records, does not know where in the cemetery Booth is buried.
That is absolutely the case.
And that is why, as Frank mentioned earlier, the testimony from Dr. Stars talking about how it would be an archaeological dig to try to find Booth is 100% correct, and not even one that would be limited to the Booth family plot, because the possibility exists that Booth may have been put in secret somewhere else.
I suppose that's correct. Yes.
Wonderful.
Hey, can I?
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
Yes, Frank.
So on this subject, since it's clear that the cemetery does not know where John Wilkes is buried, that does not mean that others don't have strong opinions as to where he is buried.
Yes.
So we have witnesses, and Terry Offord can speak to this, and Mike as well, who have some idea of, they believe, where he's buried based on facts. The funeral was reported in many newspapers. When the phone call came up, we already had in evidence that Edwin Booth had directed an unmarked grave and all of that with respect to the Booth family plot. And I remember consulting with Bill, what do we want to do with this? I said, it's certainly going to put a death knell. That'll be the end of it if this evidence comes in, because that throws it not only in the Booth family plot, but the whole cemetery. And I said, Bill, you sure you want to do that? Because that may not look good for the cemetery records. And Bill said, whatever comes out, comes out. So, but that doesn't mean, just from speaking for myself, that you don't know for sure whether he's buried in the Booth family plot. I believe he is, but others can speak to that. But I don't think anyone really thought that you didn't have any idea where the Booth family, where John Wilkes is buried. It just showed you how wide the possibilities might be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think Frank addressing like, yeah, there are reports about the funeral. And so from those, we can pretty much draw the conclusion he's in the plot, but again, unmarked, and therefore we don't know where he is. And to try to find him would require this sort of architecture, this archaeological dig. Um, Bill, I got one more question for you here. As we mentioned it before, during the pre and even post-trial proceedings, Mark Zaid alleged that Greenmount did not have standing to oppose this exhumation, as he considered it like a family matter. And Greenmount's involvement was, of course, ultimately upheld in both instances. Um, do cemeteries normally play a role in exhumation proceedings?
Yes, it really doesn't matter what Mr. Sage thought.
Yeah. And
The
why do you think he
law is
tried to do that?
otherwise. The law is otherwise, and the cemetery has a fiduciary equivalent to a fiduciary duty to the families who's who have given the cemetery the remains of the casket of a dear family member to be buried. They expect security. They expect beauty in the area. And they expect care and quiet repose for. And that is the duty that the cemetery enters into.
Well, and even Edwin Booth, I believe, paid for perpetual care of that plot, which would
Well,
cost more money
that's
back then.
well, yeah, I can tell you, it wasn't very much either.
Oh, okay. Should have been more for how long perpetuity is. Yeah,
that, but no, I'm not. I don't mean that in a snide way. I'm just
sure.
saying that the perpetual care, there's the income from the perpetual care fund is nowhere near enough to to meet the expenses of the nonprofit corporation, which is the Greenmount Cemetery. We need money from an endowment. We needed money from the cremations and so on and so forth.
Understood. Um, well, it seems that Zaid was trying to remove you just because he hoped to just get it under the radar, where if you weren't allowed to be against it, then he was hoping that he could just do it because we no one to stand against. If the cemetery doesn't have any standing, then it just seemed a way to avoid having to do this trial at all. All right, thank you, Bill.
You're
So
welcome.
after Bill, after you testified, it was Mike's turn to take the stand. And as Frank recounts in his book in describing Mike, he says that Mike had a thick mane of hair and a gregarious personality. And so, Mike, I got a slight side view here where we can see your mane of hair kind of coming off the back there. This is another anonymous picture I got. You see you standing in front of Michael O'Loughlin's grave at Greenmount Cemetery. Um, Frank also describes you, Mike, as the most energetic member of the group with lots of ideas. And during this, your first appearance on the stand, you described several instances of fraud associated with Finus Bates's book, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. While several Booth escape stories predate Bates's book, his work has long been recognized as the tome for escape theorists. And even as Nate attempted to distance himself from the book when he took the stand, he still expressed his agreement with the ideas and concepts from that book. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you, do you think there would have been an exhumation trial at all had Finus Bates not written his book?
Oh, I couldn't imagine anything. Uh, this was the clearinghouse of all this information, and there were, I imagine, hundreds of different. I tried tracing down a lot of these things. I traveled to Northern California and other places where Booth supposedly had lived long after the assassination, and it's just unbelievable how many different stories there were associated that had nothing to do with Finus Bates or any of his ideas, but he consolidated a number of different stories, put them all together, and had a book that was essentially, for its time, kind of a bestseller. It really did. It really did leave a mark on the public consciousness. And when people talk about it, even today, I mean, they go back to the Bates book. They don't really have anything else where they could put their finger on something and say, "Ha ha!" Right there. What most people don't know is one of those uh, earliest of Booth escape stories had this old guy um, settling in Guntown, Mississippi. Well, where Finest Bates lived as a child and grew up was Guntown, Mississippi. So he had this thing in his head since childhood, probably, and just decided to make it his own. And what he did with it was put it out there to the public.
So, what are your thoughts on the character of Mr. Bates and his motivations for writing this book?
I don't like psychoanalyzing people, but I think it's safe to say that he was the kind of person who didn't care that much about the details, about making sure that every I is dotted and T is crossed. And he also didn't seem to care that much whether he got caught in a lie or anything, because, you know, uh, he puts this stuff out in print and it's so easy to disprove. He didn't do much research. I mean, the book starts out by saying Abraham Lincoln was born in Bethel, Kentucky, and I looked that up, and it's 180 miles from where Abraham Lincoln was born. Um, so he was careless, and he didn't care how careless he was. Um, it's hard to analyze somebody who's like that, because I can't relate to it at all. And
It sounds
uh,
like he'd make a good politician today, though, where he doesn't care about being caught in his lies.
we have seen people in the public life who are like that. They'll just throw things out there, and this is not a slam at any particular group, but uh, I saw a televangelist one time going on and on and on about things, and I thought, just for kicks, whenever he quotes scripture, I'm going to look it up. And it was always in each and every case, it was always just completely, no, that's not what it says.
Mm.
And I think I don't understand what motivates people like that. They're so focused on the end result that they don't really care. Maybe they know something we don't know, that it really isn't going to come back to them. Um,
Do you think it
I
was
guess.
financial, or did you think Bates actually believed kind of what he wrote and what he claimed he interviewed John St. Helen, who made this confession? Do you think that there's any nuggets of truth in there, or was it more of a ploy? Is he more straight up a fraudster and looking just to make a buck?
Well, he might just be looking to make a buck. This was actually the second manuscript that he wrote.
Hmm.
He sent one to Macmillan Publishers a few years before, and uh, I guess around late 1890s, I guess, and they rejected it. And uh, and then along came this story in out of Enid, Oklahoma, about this man who killed himself and claimed that, he was really John Wilkes Booth and he killed the greatest man who ever lived, which I can't see John Wilkes Booth, even after the
Yeah.
passage of time, saying that about Abraham Lincoln. But but anyway, um, the local papers picked it up in Memphis, and I discovered later on that the reporter in Memphis who put it in the paper, a man named David Rankin Barbie, whose
Ah,
papers, yeah,
yeah.
whose papers have been preserved, and he took a lifelong interest as a result of this story. And somebody had written to him once and asked him, "Where did you get your information for that story about David E. George committing suicide and claiming he was John Wilkes Booth?" And he said, "I got it from a lawyer in Memphis named Finest Bates." So Bates claimed he read this in the paper, but he fed it to the paper to begin with. There are all sorts of little back channel maneuverings that he did, and I don't know how much of it has ever come out actually, but you know, it's hard to say whether it's for the money or for the attention or maybe both. Um, I couldn't imagine expecting the money to be that
Was
good,
he still going for that reward money from the government from 1865? His
Yeah,
$50,000?
he could have done it. Yeah, yeah. It's already paid, but we'll just pay you some more,
Yeah.
you know.
Interesting. So, due to the lateness of the hour on this day of testimony, your testimony was paused, Mike. And at that point, Judge Kaplan, which I have a picture here, we've talked a lot about him, but we haven't seen him yet. So, let me share that. Here's Judge Kaplan. He ordered a about a week-long break between the third and fourth and final day of testimony. So, Frank, Mike, I'll come back to you in a little bit, but Frank, I'm going to go to you now. How did you feel about the proceedings after these first 3 days of testimony? Obviously, Mike was only partly done, and Terry, sorry, it's been a while since we talked to you, but you hadn't even taken the stand yet. But Zaid had already presented all of his witnesses at this time. So, Frank, how are you feeling? You still had your big guns left to go.
Yeah, so I felt good about where we were, but there were some bumps in the road, and I very much wanted to get to Terry Alford, complete Mike, and get to the end of the case with James O. Hall. So there were accusations during that 1 week break that we hadn't really the cemetery hadn't produced all the documents. So Bill Trimble was recharged by the judge to go back and make sure. And secondly, Mark thought he had found something bad that the cemetery was doing, that selling tours of the cemetery for money and asking, I guess it was either Terry or Michael Kaufman, how, or maybe Bill
I
Trimble,
think it was
actually.
Bill.
Yeah, how the booth would feel knowing that you're selling tickets to the public and making money off her son's grave. And it turned out that it was a non-profit situation. So, but there were some things to worry about. We had to come up with, double check our records. So the week was a week of work and accomplishment, but I was looking forward to continuing our case.
Wonderful. Terry, I'm going to come to you real quick. Because according to Frank's book, you attended the trial every day. And so what are your memories of those kind of first 3 days of the courtroom, listening to your colleagues and the opposing witnesses?
Well, I had a shocking realization.
Hmm.
I had to drive to Baltimore every day.
From Northern Virginia.
Two of the busiest beltways in the United States. If it hadn't been for Frank, I would have done it. I swear to God. But I picked up Mr. Hall. I brought him. He rode with me. So it made the time pass well. And it was good. I was frankly entertained by the whole thing. You may remember there was a Lincoln lookalike who came one day,
wow.
sitting in the audience. And he looked disapprovingly, like, why is Booth getting all the attention, And there were various celebrities, even a clairvoyant there who wanted to stand. So, it was very good. And lunchtime was always fun, because we could run out and rehash and then come back. But yeah, I don't know if this is the right thing to say, but I enjoyed the whole thing. I had actually been on a federal drug trial as in the jury, a long, multi-day thing. So I had experienced like sitting in the jury box and just watching the court dynamics, watching this person, that person, the judge. So, I kind of had a feeling for, how things were going to go. And again, I like my word dynamics. I think I had some feeling for what was happening and found it a great experience, and thank Frank for bringing me into it.
It does sound far more entertaining, because you would think, oh, it's a trial, it's kind of boring, but when you're really into the subject matter, even and I had no idea that there were clairvoyants and Lincoln impersonators in the courtroom. That definitely makes it interesting.
Yeah.
And I know Frank has said there were courtroom artists in there doing sketches and things like that. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to find really any of them, but yeah, it does sound like it was. And I guess Terry, did the attention, Frank mentions the press on that first day, and though they were denied recording inside, was the press pretty consistent as you continued, or was it first day thing and then maybe we'll come back on the last day? Do you remember?
It sort of played out a little bit as the trial went on.
That makes sense.
But they kind of like James Hall. He had that kind of Oklahoma folksy
Mhm.
way, and the camera just gravitated toward those people, and that's the way that was.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Terry. All right, so let's then go to the final day of the trial. So I'm going to share all of our witnesses on this last day. The final day of the trial is Thursday, May 25th, and as Frank said, during that week-long recess, Bill was tasked with the judge by doing more investigation into Greenmount's records to verify that there was no document that proved exactly where Booth was buried. And this and Bill, of course, already talked about this. And so then he was, when this day started, he was asked to testify. Bill talked about, again, the records in place at Greenmount and how it does lack like an exact location for Booth. We know he's buried in this Greenmount, but where exactly, we are unsure. And this played into the archaeological dig thing from Dr. Stars to be like, this is the records that we have. There's no one is hiding anything. It's just there was secrecy involved in his burial, as ordered by Marianne Booth and Edwin Booth, and this is what we have, Judge. And then Mike, you then retook the stand and continued kind of where you left off from the day before. You kind of talked a little bit about Bates, and then today you were kind of talking about more stuff. So I guess Mike, I'm gonna come back to you. Do you recall first how you spent that week between your two testimonies? Did you and Frank practice at all in between, or were you feeling good after the first session?
Honestly, it's so long ago, I don't remember exactly, but I don't recall, you know, rehearsing or anything like that. Um, I knew pretty well what I was going to say. I'd been up to Georgetown. I went through the papers, that some of the information that went into Bates's book was right there in its original form. And to me, it was a slam dunk when you look at what Bates wrote, and then you saw the
Originals.
original item that he was referring to. It's like, wow, that doesn't line up at all.
Yeah.
And I just was going to talk about that, and
Yeah,
it
and
was pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and your testimony harmonized a lot with Steve's testimony from earlier as you recounted the many identifications of John Wilkes Booth during his escape by those present at the Garrett farm where he was killed, and you painted a very clear picture that everyone who saw Booth's body was convinced they had the right man. And then it came time for Mr. Zaid's cross-examination, and in Frank's book, he recalls that Zaid took a conversational, mode with you during his cross-examination, perhaps thinking you might lose focus and slip into conjecture. What are your memories of Mr. Zaid and the cross-examination? And did you feel any apprehension leading up to Zaid's cross as opposed to Frank's, asking you of questions? How did you feel about Mr. Zaid?
I I don't recall anymore after all this time, but it seemed to me I didn't really overthink it or anything. I mean, I knew Mark, and I knew this was an early case for him, and as it was for me. And I mean, at the worst case scenarios, this was going to be a battle of wits between unarmed opponents. And no offense to him, uh, but anyway, I was more focused on things that I was going to talk about, like the tintype that supposedly proved John Wilkes Booth lived in Texas in the 1870s and all that. And it was so easy uh, to show the flaws in those pieces of evidence. and I was really just looking forward to that.
Let's talk about one of the pieces of evidence. And you sent me a nice picture of it, so let me bring it up real quick. It was an affidavit. Let me share this. So, Mike, tell us about kind of this affidavit.
This affidavit came about a week or so after David E. George's death in Enid, Oklahoma. And he had died in the Grand Avenue Hotel. And Finus Bates is in town by this time, and he's trying to gather up information and evidence to support his pre-existing theory about John Wilkes Booth. And and so he gets the hotel owner and the clerk of the hotel to sign this affidavit, and they go on about all this business, sort of mundane business about what was going on at the time, and that they heard this moaning, and they went into the room and they found David E. George uh, uh, dying, and that was the end of it.
Hmm.
And then it was notarized, and they put the seal with its the raised bumps and everything on it. And in Bates's book, he quotes all of this verbatim, but he added almost an entire paragraph at the bottom, this dramatic scene about David E. George confessing to being John Wilkes Booth and so on, that is not in the original affidavit. Instead, what you see in the original affidavit is
So
George.
I can see the line. Yeah, George
Yeah,
declaring on his deathbed that he was John Wilkes Booth. It's a different color ink from the stuff around it.
it was added later, and it was added later because on the left side of that,
There you
uh,
go.
yeah, you see the raised lettering of the notary seal, and whoever added those words to it, his pen kept bumping into those uh, the
Yeah, you can see it
embossed,
actually. It looks like it's
into the
pressed
embossed
in.
letters,
Yeah, and
and
it
he's
goes into
having
it.
trouble negotiating his way around that notary seal, which was already there. And so that's not what they what they swore to. Their part in all this ended before, and now somebody's coming back and is adding this word, this sentence uh, to an already sworn affidavit, saying that on his deathbed, he said that he was really John Wilkes Booth. Until that point, there was nothing in the affidavit even remotely like that. And of course, you compare it to the book, and there's a whole paragraph where there is only one sentence here,
Mhm.
and he couldn't put the entire paragraph in there because there wasn't room.
Right.
Uh, he just measured out, I guess, how much space he had, and decided to put those words in there and make it look a little bit uh, as as though they had sworn to the confession, which they did not.
So this is part of kind of as you talked about just the fraud that Finest Spade says is definitely fraud. It wasn't just him picking, accounts that fit his ideas, but there was an active case of fraud in the composition of his book to make it seem like he had real evidence when he didn't.
Absolutely. There's so much trickery involved in all this, and it's not an innocent mistake and somebody reading the evidence a certain way. It's somebody doctoring the evidence to make it look the way he wants it to look.
Yeah. So there were many people then and now who argued in favor of the exhumation, not because they genuinely believed the Booth escape justice theories, but because they figured the act would settle the matter. And in fact, Mark Zaid himself continually represented this as a case of trying to deal with a historical question and settle a historical controversy once and for all. Now, as a historian who has dealt with this conspiracy and other conspiracies, can you kind of explain the fallacy of this view? Like, why wouldn't digging up Booth, or even now, put this whole thing to rest, as some people argue?
Well, this is all based on sort of a conspiracy mindset. And the conspiracy mindset, one of its trademarks is the moving goalposts, where you would say, oh, we know that it's not really Booth because he had this. And then you show that he did have that in fact, and we've now met your condition. Oh, well, here's a new condition. Now we know Booth should have had that, and it didn't show up in the photograph. And okay, well, now we can address that, and beyond a doubt, we have addressed that. Okay, now, and it just keeps going. There is this determination to be right about something that there just isn't any substance to it, and it is it's present in every conspiracy theory that I know of. People just aren't going to be satisfied by it unless you get something that is going to really knock it out of the park, like DNA and proper use of DNA, which is another, you know, because we've got those other people in the grave with allegedly with John Wilkes Booth and so on. Did we get the right corpse that we took the DNA from, and then do we have the right people living today who contributed their DNA for the comparison? I mean, there's always a way around something, and if you're going to get something ironclad, then you will silence probably 90% of the people, which is good.
Yeah.
That's the best you can hope for, maybe. But and I would have supported an exhumation if we had anything like that. But what they were asking for kind of moved around a bit and settled on basically looking at him and saying, "Does this look like John Wilkes Booth?" It was really just about that weak.
Yeah,
No, it's not gonna settle anything.
yeah, and I agree with you, because even with, we look at, ironclad DNA, but the true believers are, and Steve, I've talked to Steve about this before, and he's made mention to be like, well, sure, but if we actually dug him up and were able to use DNA and confirm it's him, the conspiracy would be, well, in 1865 there was a government conspiracy to bury a different man, who's saying in 2025 that they're not still covering it up by claiming the DNA matches, but it doesn't. You would still have the believers who would see that there was something nefarious, because Steve has said the government did it. If the government's in charge of it, well, then there's something nefarious. And so even this idea of as technology has changed, you are correct. In 95, DNA was the belief was only that it only come through the mother's line of DNA was the only comparison. We have improved DNA since then, but in 95 they were really just going to do this photo superimposition thing to see, does this skull look like it could have been John Wilkes Booth's skull based on pictures and things like that. But even with modern standards, you still would have these people who would, when it was confirmed, if it was confirmed to be Booth, would still not believe it, and it wouldn't end the controversy to those people.